There was a time when your presence was dismissed like background noise. You offered your light, not flamboyantly, but sincerely. Little flickers of hope, warmth, loyalty, understanding, and they treated it like ambiance, not a gift. They didn't just overlook it, they rejected it with intention. They spoke to you like you were expendable, treated your empathy like a sponge meant to absorb their damage, their stories, their chaos, until it broke. And when it finally did, when the silence of your exhaustion replaced the sound of your kindness, they called you cold. But you weren't cold. You were depleted. You were in the dark. Because they left you there, willingly. And now, from the pit they once tossed you into, they stretch their hands out, begging for your fire to guide them home. But what they don't realize is, darkness doesn't break you. It reconfigures you. It strips away the illusions, the performance, the fantasy of reciprocity. You learned how to generate warmth from your own bones when no one was offering it. You stopped waiting for a rescue that was never coming. That's the difference. They think they're returning to the same person they left in the shadows. They don't know that the dark version of you no longer seeks the light. They are the light now. You built it inside you, brick by brutal brick. And that light doesn't beg to be seen anymore. It doesn't ask for approval. It glows in defiance of all who doubted it. And now that you've become what they tried to escape, they return, trying to bask in a flame they never earned. You were once soft, soft in the way a sunrise is soft, inviting, open, patient. But people confuse softness with weakness. They think warmth means permission, so they crossed your boundaries while calling it love. They dismissed your insight as overthinking. Your loyalty became their playground. You weren't placed in the dark. You were pushed there, systematically, with subtle digs, rejections disguised as humor, abandonment wrapped in pretty lies. And in that darkness, you faced yourself. You met the version of you that had no one left to please, the one who no longer begged to be understood, the one who rose from loneliness without becoming bitter, just sharper. That's the one they're trying to return to now. Not the one they left, the one that came back lit. Psychologically, people return to the light, not because they've changed, but because they've been starved of attention. Your light was never just about joy. It made them feel significant, validated. You reflected their best selves back at them. But now, when they stare at the new you, all they see is the consequence of their neglect. You no longer mirror what they want. You reveal what they are. And that is terrifying. Because your energy no longer seeks harmony. It demands alignment. And when they realize they no longer match your frequency, they panic. They try to mold themselves into who they think you'll accept. But you don't feed illusions anymore. You burn them down. They speak gently now. They walk on verbal eggshells. They quote the things you once said to them, lines they once ignored, trying to revive your faith in them. But it's too late, because you weren't just in the dark. You studied in it. You took notes. You reassembled yourself. And now, you don't run toward anyone. You don't chase love. You radiate. That's the punishment they never saw coming. Not revenge, not anger, evolution. They remember the old you like a ghost they abandoned. And now, they want to haunt it, begging for one more moment in the glow they didn't protect. You gave them everything when you were unsure of your worth. You gave without keeping score, believing that light was meant to be shared. But now that you've understood your value, you no longer place your fire in hands that tremble with insecurity. You don't illuminate paths for those who once laughed at your clarity. This isn't bitterness, it's intelligence. You learn that not everyone deserves warmth. Some people only seek light to hide from their own shadows. And now, when they approach, claiming they've changed, you smile, not in forgiveness, but in freedom. Because the light you offer now is not a gift, it's a boundary. They'll tell stories about you now, not as a villain, but as the one that got away, the one they didn't understand until it was too late, the one they watched crawl through despair, only to rise with eyes that no longer looked back. And the irony? They didn't believe in your strength when you were quiet. They didn't believe in your value when it wasn't loud. Now that it glows, without needing their validation, they want in. They want to hold what they once dropped. But you don't pick up what tried to bury you. You let it stay where it belongs, beneath you. You've become the light source people now seek, not because you offer salvation, but because you remind them what it feels like to be seen without illusion. Your eyes no longer plead, they pierce. And when they speak, hoping to charm their way back into your orbit, all they find is distance. Not because you're cruel, but because you remember. You remember the hours you cried with no one listening, the days you questioned your worth in rooms filled with people. You remember what it felt like to be treated like an afterthought, and you vowed, never again. You weren't overreacting. You were neurologically wounded. But wounds deepen awareness, and awareness sharpens the flame. They scoffed at your silence, labeled your truth as dramatics, and laughed at the shiver in your voice when the mask slipped. They said you overreacted, too intense, too sensitive. You were too much in the exact moment your nervous system sounded the alarm, that internal siren of betrayal, of threat, of someone close becoming a stranger in front of your eyes. But it wasn't paranoia. It was a bruise being pressed again. One you didn't ask for. One they didn't care about. Your body remembered what your mind was trying to justify. And that was never overreaction. That was a system in survival mode. A soul that had seen enough to know when safety has been traded for performance. But they didn't want to hear that. They didn't want you to be informed. They wanted you confused. Because confused people are quiet, and your silence made them feel safe. Until it didn't. You weren't fragile. You were triggered. There's a difference. Your nervous system wasn't malfunctioning. It was functioning too well. Years of unspoken trauma had trained your body to pick up on patterns others never noticed. You saw the flicker in their eyes when they lied. You heard the fracture in their voice when their story shifted. You felt the chill in the room before anyone even raised their voice. They called it overthinking, but it was hyper-awareness, an evolutionary adaptation. You were reading danger where others saw calm because you had been through fire before. And when the heat returned, even in the smallest form, your whole being remembered. But they didn't want to acknowledge that memory, because if they did, they'd have to admit that their actions carried weight, that their behavior was the blade, and your reaction was the wound reopening, not the cause of chaos. They always want the reaction to be the villain. They point at your volume, not their provocation, at your tears, not their detachment. They think survival instincts are emotional tantrums because they've never been forced to build armor in their own skin. But while they mocked you, while they labeled your instincts as instability, they overlooked the most dangerous side effect of all. awareness. Because when pain doesn't get soothed, it turns into perception. You stop trying to be understood and start trying to understand everything. And from that point forward, you don't walk into rooms blindly anymore. You scan, you calculate, you measure silence, you predict behavior. You build your internal radar from the same neurons that once screamed in panic. And now that you've upgraded, now that your wounds became weapons, they look confused. But that's the thing. They only noticed the fire. They never cared about the spark that caused it. You were neurologically wounded, and then you evolved. They thought they were shaping you, when in fact, they were chiseling away everything that no longer served your survival. You learned how to stay still while being hunted emotionally. You learned how to decode smiles, how to brace yourself for softness that turned sharp without warning. And somewhere in all that recoil, your mind rewired. You stopped making excuses for people who used your heart like a pressure valve. You stopped absorbing the tension in every room as if it was your job to resolve it. You stopped asking yourself, "Did I take it wrong?" and started asking, "Why did they think that was okay?" That's the turning point. The moment the flame sharpens. The moment the victim becomes the observer. And once that switch flips, they lose control of the narrative. They want you to forget how it felt. That's their only defense. Because if you forget, they get to rewrite it. They get to call it a misunderstanding, a moment of stress, an accident. But you haven't forgotten. Your cells remember. And now that memory doesn't paralyze you. It guides you. It turns you into the kind of person who doesn't need confirmation to believe what they feel. The kind of person who walks away without an argument. The kind who doesn't offer second chances to first betrayals. They wanted your reaction to prove your weakness. But all it did was prove your depth. And now they flinch when you speak with certainty. Because they know you're no longer seeking their clarity. You already found your own. The irony is, your overreaction was often the moment your instincts tried to save you. But they painted you as unstable because they needed you to doubt your own radar. They wanted your loyalty, not your logic. They wanted your devotion, not your discernment. But what they didn't account for was your transformation. They thought the pain would break you. It built you. They thought invalidation would keep you quiet. It turned you into an archivist of truth. You started noticing the hidden variables, the body language shifts, the silence before the insult, the compliments that carried agendas. And the more they denied your reality, the more fluent you became in reading theirs. That's not delusion. That's evolution. Now, you walk through life with a different kind of vision. Not wide-eyed, not hopeful, but clear, sharp, calm. And they don't know how to deal with that, because you no longer wait for explanations. You don't ask people to clarify behavior that contradicts their words. You simply believe what you feel. You believe your body, your gut, your energy. And that belief, that self-trust, it terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. They can't manipulate someone who doesn't need their version of the story. They can't gaslight someone who left the room before the match was lit. And they can't control someone who already built their fire in solitude. Your sixth sense didn't come from magic. It came from trauma, from being repeatedly invalidated until you had no choice but to become your own compass. And now, people can't lie to you without trembling. Not because you threaten them, but because you see them. You see their patterns, their tells, their inconsistencies. You don't call it out. You don't need to. You let them think they got away with it, until your absence delivers the verdict. That's what they don't recover from. Not being caught, but being quietly understood. Because understanding is irreversible. And once you've seen someone clearly, you never unsee it. Most seeds only sprout underground, in total darkness. You weren't buried. You were being rooted. They looked at your silence and assumed it was defeat. They saw your withdrawal, your isolation, your stillness, and whispered that you'd given up. But what they didn't understand, what they'll never admit, is that you weren't disappearing. You were incubating. You were growing in the one place most people fear to enter: yourself. No audience, no applause, no validation, just soil, weight, pressure, silence thick enough to suffocate the weak and shape the dangerous. They thought they'd buried you. They thought the darkness would rot you from within. But the truth is, only something that still plans to rise can survive being pressed that deep into the earth. You weren't breaking. You were rooting. Deep. Permanent. Quiet. And now that the soil starts to shift, now that the first green shoot pushes through the dirt, they're terrified. Because what grows in silence often returns unstoppable. The world taught you to fear the dark, to associate it with endings, with loss, with death. But the darkness is where all life begins. Wombs, caves, forest floors. Every sacred transformation takes place where no one can see it. And while they thought your absence meant failure, you were learning how to breathe without oxygen. You were studying pressure, studying pain, figuring out which parts of yourself would survive without sunlight. And when you found those pieces, those rare, resilient fragments of your truth, you wrapped your roots around them like steel. That's what makes you dangerous now. You're not just growing, you're anchored. Anchored in a place they thought would destroy you. And every inch you rise now carries the memory of the weight they tried to crush you with. They fed you dirt, thinking it would choke you, thinking that shame and rejection and betrayal would turn to poison in your blood. But they forgot. Soil is where the strongest things start. Your pain did not dissolve you. It defined you. It taught you what to shed, what to keep, what to resurrect. It gave you clarity, not confusion. It stripped away the noise and left only signal. And in that signal, you heard the call of your own name, not the one they gave you, the one you remembered, the one you buried years ago to make others comfortable. That name, that self, it's back now, and it's growing through the very ground they once walked on, thinking they had seen the last of you. You didn't fight for light, not at first. You didn't crave visibility, you craved truth. And truth, when unearthed in darkness, does not need to explain itself to the sun. They don't understand how calm you've become. They mistake it for weakness still. But calm forged in the underground is not fragility. It is patience, precision, the kind of patience that waits for the right moment to break through, not just to rise, but to dominate. They won't recognize you when you fully emerge, not because you've changed, but because you've become. You shed everything they used to manipulate you. You shed the softness that wasn't serving you. And now, you move differently, like a tree with roots too deep to be pushed over by storms. They'll say you were gone too long, that you disappeared. But what they mean is, they could no longer access the version of you they took advantage of, the one that needed approval, the one that mistook tolerance for love. That version, it decomposed, became fertilizer for the one who's here now. And now that you're visible again, brighter, bolder, unshakable, they want to act like nothing happened. But you remember the silence they left you in. the hollow absence of hands when you were screaming inside. You remember how they watched you sink and said you were too heavy to carry. But now that you're rising, they want to pretend they knew you'd make it all along. There's a violence in rebirth that no one warns you about. You don't return tender. You return with fire under your skin. You return knowing the taste of dirt. You return knowing that no one is coming to rescue you but yourself. And once you rise like that, with roots that deep and hunger that old, no one can ever pull you back underground again. Not with their shame, not with their silence, not with their half-hearted regrets. You don't belong to the surface anymore. You belong to the depth. You carry it with you now. Every step, every word, every choice. You are the reminder that darkness does not mean death. It means foundation. They keep staring like they don't recognize you anymore. Good. That's the point. You didn't survive to stay familiar. You rose to become unreachable. They should feel uncomfortable now. They should question every moment they called you weak. Because they weren't witnessing your fall. They were witnessing your formation. And now that you move without explaining yourself, without shrinking, without checking their temperature before you speak, they're rattled. Because they can no longer predict you. And people fear what they can't predict. But that fear, that's your power now. Let them sit with it. You don't owe them your petals. Not after they turned away during your planting. Let them miss the bloom. Let them regret not watering you when they had the chance. You will not open for them again. You will not shrink back into seed to make them feel safe. You've grown in terrain that kills lesser spirits. You bloomed without comfort, without permission. And now, you tower, and they're left whispering to each other about how you did it. But the truth is, they were too loud to hear your becoming. And now, they're too far behind to catch your echo. When they couldn't see your value, they called it irrelevant. When the world did, they called it luck. They studied you with dull eyes, the kind that could only perceive what was already labeled by others. When you were in the process of becoming, when your hands were dirty, your thoughts unfinished, your gifts not yet polished, they shrugged. Not because they truly believed you were worthless, but because they couldn't categorize you. And what they can't categorize, they dismiss. You offered them substance, but they were only trained to respond to sparkle. Your value wasn't marketable to them yet. You were early, too early for their shallow gaze. So they called you irrelevant. Not because you were, but because your power wasn't digestible enough for their untrained palate. And the irony? You were doing the very thing most cannot, building in obscurity. They'll never admit that part. Because it would require acknowledging that they stood in the presence of potential and chose to turn away. You were solving puzzles they didn't even know existed. Crafting a vision that went beyond their comprehension. But in a world that worships finished products, the blueprint is invisible. And that's what you were, a living blueprint, breathing design. And because they couldn't monetize it, mock it, or mimic it, they called it noise. Too intense, too abstract, too different. It was always too much of something. But not once did they stop and ask what it could become. Because that would have required humility. It would have required seeing beyond the moment. But they don't do that. They only believe in value once it has a price tag attached. And you weren't selling. You were becoming. And now that the transformation is undeniable, now that the noise you made turned into symphonies, now that others are lining up to hear you speak, they call it luck. They claim you got lucky because it excuses their apathy. Because if your success was random, then they weren't wrong to ignore you. But deep down, they know. They saw the flicker in your eyes. They heard the power in your tone. They felt your presence shift the air in a room, and they chose to look away. That's the sin they can't forgive themselves for. Not that they doubted you, but that they missed their chance to stand beside you before the world took notice. And now, all they can do is rewrite the story. Twist your climb into something that fell into your lap